We need to move her out before she finds out. That was the first line I saw on the screen, glowing softly in the quiet of my kitchen, and for a moment I truly believed I had misread it, that my tired eyes at 68 had played a cruel trick on me. But the words didn't change, they didn't soften, they just sat there, cold, deliberate, unmistakable, while the hum of my dishwasher filled the silence behind me and the scent of lemon soap clung to my hands. Emily had left her tablet on the counter just minutes earlier, rushing out the door. With a distracted smile and a quick, "I'll be right back," and I had picked it up only to move it somewhere safe. That was all. That's what I told myself even now. But then the notification appeared, a group chat lighting up with a new message, and I froze, my fingers hovering over the screen, my heart suddenly beating in a way that didn't belong to a quiet Tuesday evening in a house I had lived in for over 30 years. I should have looked away. I know that. I was raised better than that, but something about the phrasing, the urgency, the word her, it pulled at something deep inside me, something instinctive and protective, and before I could stop myself, I tapped the screen. The conversation opened instantly, as if it had been waiting for me, and there they were, names I recognized more intimately than my own reflection. Emily, my daughter-in-law, and Daniel, my son, along with a third name I didn't immediately place, all woven together in a thread of messages that stretched back. Weeks, maybe months, and as I read, slowly at first, and then faster, my breath began to shorten, each sentence landing heavier than the last. They weren't just talking about schedules or family dinners or holiday plans. No, they were talking about me, about my house, about timelines and next steps, about how long it would take before I would agree to something I had never even been asked about. And then there it was again. Another message from Emily, casual and sharp all at once. She won't fight it. She never does. I felt something inside my chest tighten, not a sharp pain, not something you could point to and name, but a slow, spreading pressure, like realization itself was taking up space where trust used to live. I kept scrolling, my hands steadier than I felt, reading words I knew I could never unread, seeing pieces of my life reduced to inconveniences and strategies, my presence described as temporary, my home discussed like it was already theirs. And somewhere in the middle of it all, I saw Daniel's response, short, simple, and more devastating than anything else. Just make sure she doesn't suspect anything yet. I stopped then, the kitchen suddenly too quiet, the air too still, and I stood there with that tablet in my hands, the same hands that had once held him when he was small, when he trusted me completely, when I believed that bond could never be rewritten into something this cold. I set the tablet back down exactly where I had found it, the screen still glowing, the conversation still open, and I turned back to the sink, picking up a plate I had already washed just minutes earlier, because in that moment I understood something very clearly. Whatever they thought they were planning, whatever they believed I didn't see, they were wrong, and the biggest mistake they had made wasn't leaving that tablet behind. It was assuming I wouldn't understand what I was looking at. I stood at the sink long after the last dish had been rinsed, my hands moving out of habit while my mind replayed every word I had just read, each sentence settling into place like a puzzle I had never wanted to solve. And the strangest part was not the shock itself, but how quickly it began to make sense, how pieces of the past that once felt harmless or confusing now aligned with a clarity that felt almost cruel. The quiet distance in Daniel's voice over the past year, the way Emily would answer questions I had directed at him, the small changes in routine that I had dismissed as modern life moving too fast for old habits. All of it returned to me now, sharper, heavier, impossible to ignore. I dried my hands slowly and looked around the kitchen, the same kitchen where I had cooked thousands of meals, where birthdays had been celebrated with homemade cakes and candles that burned too quickly, where laughter once filled every corner without effort. And for the first time it felt unfamiliar, as if I were standing in someone else's home, observing a life that had already begun to slip away without my permission. I walked to the table and sat down, folding my hands together, forcing myself to breathe evenly, because whatever I felt in that moment could not be allowed to show. Not yet. Not when I had only seen a fragment of what they were planning. Not when I did not yet understand how far this went. I thought about the message again, the certainty in Emily's words, she will not fight it. And I wondered when exactly I had become that version of myself in their eyes. The quiet woman who would accept whatever was decided for her. The one who would nod politely and step aside. And I realized with a steady, unsettling calm that perhaps I had helped create that image without meaning to, by choosing peace over confrontation, by trusting that love would always outweigh convenience. A memory surfaced then, clear and precise, from just a few months earlier when Daniel had mentioned how expensive the house must be to maintain, how much easier things would be in a smaller place, and I had laughed it off, telling him I knew every inch of this home and could manage just fine. But I remembered now the way Emily had exchanged a glance with him, quick and silent, a look I had not understood at the time. I pushed my chair back and stood, moving toward the hallway where the tablet still rested on the counter, untouched since I had set it down. The screen now dimmed, but still holding everything I had seen just moments before, and for a brief second I considered turning it on again, reading deeper, uncovering every detail right then and there, but I stopped myself, because instinct told me that knowledge, once fully revealed, would demand a response, and I was not ready to give them that yet. Instead, I reached for a towel and carefully wiped a spot on the counter that did not need cleaning, grounding myself in something simple and controlled, something that belonged to me. Outside, I could hear a car passing by, the low hum of tires against pavement reminding me that the world beyond this house continued as it always had, indifferent to the quiet unraveling happening within these walls. I walked back to the living room and sat down in my usual chair, the one Daniel had bought me years ago, saying I deserved something comfortable, and I ran my fingers along the fabric, remembering how proud he had been when he gave it to me, how genuine his smile had seemed, and I wondered when that version of my son had started to fade, or if he had simply learned to hide behind something else. Minutes passed, maybe more, I could not tell, but when I finally heard the sound of footsteps approaching the front door, light and hurried, I knew Emily had returned, and I straightened my posture, smoothing the front of my sweater, arranging my expression into something calm, something unreadable, because whatever came next, whatever role they expected me to play, I understood now that I would choose it myself, not out of weakness, but out of something far more deliberate, something they had clearly underestimated. Emily stepped inside with a quick breath, her eyes scanning the room before landing on the counter where her tablet still rested exactly where she had left it, and for a fraction of a second I saw something flicker across her face, not fear exactly, but a sharp awareness, as if she was measuring the distance between what she thought she knew and what might have changed in her absence. I remained seated in my chair, hands folded loosely in my lap, watching her without watching too closely. The way you do when you want someone to believe everything is normal. And she smiled then. That same polished smile she always wore, the one that never quite reached her eyes, and said she had forgotten something important, her voice light, but just slightly tighter than usual. I nodded and gestured toward the kitchen, telling her it was right where she left it, and she walked past me with a pace that was just a little too quick to be casual, her footsteps soft against the hardwood floor, her attention fixed ahead as though the rest of the house no longer existed. I listened to the faint sound of her picking it up, the subtle pause that followed, and I wondered if she could sense it, if there was any way for her to know that the silence she had left behind was no longer empty, but filled with everything I had read, everything I now understood. She returned a moment later, tablet in hand, her fingers wrapped around it more tightly than necessary, and she thanked me, adding something about how she could not function without it. A small laugh escaping her lips as if to smooth over something that had not yet been spoken. I smiled back, the kind of smile that requires no effort once you decide to give nothing away, and I told her she should be more careful, that it is easy to forget things when you are busy, and for a brief second her eyes met mine, searching, calculating, as though she was trying to read something beneath the surface, but I kept my expression steady, calm, the same as it had always been. She hesitated then, shifting her weight slightly, and asked if everything had been quiet while she was gone. And the question hung there between us, simple on the outside but carrying something heavier underneath, and I answered just as simply, telling her it had been a peaceful afternoon, that I had been finishing the dishes and enjoying the quiet, and I watched as she nodded, accepting the answer, or perhaps choosing to accept it, because it was easier than questioning it further. We spoke for another minute or two, small things about the weather, about Daniel working late, about how busy life had become, and each word felt carefully placed, like pieces in a game neither of us was acknowledging out loud, until she finally said she needed to get back, offering a quick hug that felt more like an obligation than affection, and I returned it with the same measured politeness, my hands resting lightly on her shoulders before stepping back. I walked her to the door, opening it as I had done countless times before, and she thanked me again, her voice softer now, almost relieved. And as she stepped outside, I noticed the way she glanced down at her tablet once more, her thumb brushing across the screen as if checking something, confirming something, before she tucked it securely under her arm. I stood in the doorway and watched her walk to her car, her posture straight, her movements efficient, and when she drove away, I closed the door gently behind her, the quiet returning to the house in a way that felt different now, heavier but also clearer, as if something hidden had finally been brought into the light. I leaned against the door for a moment, letting the stillness settle around me, and then I walked back into the kitchen, my gaze lingering on the empty space where the tablet had been, because what remained was not the object itself, but the knowledge it had carried, and the realization that whatever they had planned was already in motion, already unfolding in ways they believed I would never notice. But as I stood there, alone in the house they were so casually discussing, I understood that the advantage they thought they had was built entirely on one assumption, and that assumption was now gone. The house stayed quiet long after Emily's car disappeared down the street, but it was not the same quiet I had known before. It was sharper now, filled with meaning, and as I stood in the kitchen, I found myself looking at things differently, not as memories, but as evidence, each object holding a piece of a life I had built and protected, a life they were now discussing, as if it were already theirs to rearrange. I walked slowly through the hallway, my fingers brushing lightly against the wall, where framed photos hung in a neat line. Daniel as a little boy with a gap-toothed smile, Daniel in his graduation cap, Daniel on his wedding day standing beside Emily, and I paused there for a moment, studying that photograph more carefully than I ever had before, noticing the way Emily's hand rested on his arm, not gently but firmly, almost possessive, and the way his smile seemed slightly forced, as if he had already begun to bend in ways I had not yet recognized. I moved into the living room and sat down again, letting my gaze drift across the familiar space, and one by one, moments from the past began to surface, not as scattered memories, but as a sequence, a pattern I had missed while living inside it. There was the Thanksgiving 2 years ago when Emily had insisted they host dinner at their place instead, saying it would be easier, more modern, and I had agreed without question, only to find myself sitting at the edge of the table while decisions were made without including me, conversations flowing around me as if I were already a guest rather than family. Then there was the spring when Daniel suggested I stop driving at night, saying it was for my safety, and Emily had nodded quickly, adding that it might be time to consider simplifying things, her tone gentle but final, as if the decision had already been made somewhere else. I had accepted it then, telling myself they were just concerned, that this was what families did, they looked out for one another, but now those moments felt different, like small steps leading somewhere I had never agreed to go. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes briefly, not to escape the thoughts but to let them settle into something clearer, something I could hold on to without being overwhelmed by them. And when I opened my eyes again, I noticed the small notebook on the side table, the one I used for grocery lists and reminders, and I reached for it without hesitation. I picked up a pen and turned to a blank page, and for the first time in a very long while, I began to write not what I needed to buy or remember, but what I needed to understand, starting with simple things, dates, conversations, details I could recall, each line forming a quiet record of everything that had once seemed insignificant. I wrote about the way Daniel had gradually stopped asking my opinion on things that used to matter, about how Emily often answered questions before he could speak, about the shift in tone whenever the subject of the house came up, and as I wrote, the pieces connected in a way that left very little room for doubt. I set the pen down and looked at the page, my handwriting steady, my thoughts no longer scattered but aligned, and I realized that what I had seen on that tablet was not a sudden betrayal, but the continuation of something that had been unfolding for much longer than I had allowed myself to see. The clock on the wall ticked softly, marking time in the same steady rhythm it always had, but now each second felt more deliberate, more purposeful, as if I had crossed some invisible line between not knowing and understanding. I closed the notebook carefully and placed it back on the table, my mind already moving ahead, not with panic or anger, but with a kind of calm that surprised even me. Because if there was one thing I knew for certain, it was that understanding changes everything, and now that I understood, I would not simply stand by and let the rest unfold without me. I woke up earlier than usual the next morning, not because I had somewhere to be, but because my mind refused to rest in the comfort it once knew. And as I lay there staring at the ceiling, I realized something had shifted in me overnight, something quiet but undeniable, like a door I had kept closed for years had finally opened and would not close again. I got out of bed slowly, following the same routine I had followed for decades, making coffee, opening the curtains, letting the morning light fill the kitchen, but everything felt slightly different, not unfamiliar, just clearer, as if I were seeing my own life from a distance for the first time. I sat at the table with my coffee and reached for the notebook again, flipping to the page I had written the night before, and instead of feeling overwhelmed, I felt focused, as though each detail I had written down was no longer just a memory, but a piece of something I could work with, something I could understand on my own terms. I added more to the list, smaller things this time, conversations I had brushed aside, the way Emily often redirected plans, how she would suggest alternatives that seemed reasonable but always led to the same outcome, decisions that gradually removed me from the center of my own life. And I realized it had not happened all at once. It had been slow, almost invisible, like a tide pulling back inch by inch until the shoreline no longer looked the same. I set the pen down and looked at the clock, noting the time, knowing Daniel would likely be at work already, and Emily would be busy with her own schedule. And for the first time in a long while, I felt grateful for that distance, because it gave me something I had not had before, time to think without interruption, time to act without being watched. I stood up and walked to the hallway closet, pulling out a small box where I kept important documents, papers I had not needed to look at in years because I had always believed everything was exactly where it should be, and I carried it to the table, opening it carefully, my hands steady as I sorted through the contents, property records, insurance policies, bank statements, each one representing a part of the life I had built with my husband, a life that was now being quietly questioned without my knowledge. I paused when I found the deed to the house, running my fingers along the edge of the paper, remembering the day we signed it, the pride we felt, the certainty that this place would always be ours, and I realized then that whatever Emily and Daniel were planning, they were counting on me not to revisit these things, not to ask questions, not to look closely. I placed the document aside and continued organizing the rest, making a neat stack of everything that mattered, everything that defined what was mine. And as I did, a sense of calm settled over me, not the kind that comes from ignoring a problem, but the kind that comes from finally facing it with clear eyes. I closed the box and sat back down, my thoughts moving ahead again, considering what I had read, what I had written, and what I now knew I needed to do next. And I understood that whatever steps I took could not be rushed. They had to be precise, deliberate. Because the moment I revealed what I knew, everything would change, and I needed to be ready for that. I took a sip of my coffee, now slightly cooled, and looked around the kitchen once more, taking in every detail, every corner that held a memory, and instead of feeling like I was losing something, I felt a quiet determination building, because this was still my home, my life, and whatever they believed about me, whatever role they thought I would play in their plan, I knew now that I would. Not simply follow along, not this time, not anymore. By mid-morning, the house had settled into a familiar rhythm, but I no longer moved through it the same way. Each step now carried intention, each decision weighed carefully against what I had begun to understand. And as I stood at the kitchen counter, looking at the neatly organized stack of documents I had gathered, I realized that knowing the truth was only the first part. What mattered now was what I chose to do with it. I picked up my phone and held it in my hand for a moment, considering who to call, not out of panic, but with the same steady focus that had carried me through every difficult moment in my life. And after a brief pause, I dialed a number I had not used in years, a voice from a time when decisions like these required clarity, patience, and above all, discretion. When the call was answered, I introduced myself simply, explaining that I needed to review some personal matters, nothing urgent on the surface, just a quiet request for guidance. And I could hear in the response a recognition, a professionalism that reassured me I had made the right choice. We agreed to meet later in the week, and when I ended the call, I felt a shift inside me, not relief exactly, but a sense of direction, as if the path ahead, while still uncertain, was now visible enough to follow. I placed the phone back on the counter and turned my attention to the documents again, reviewing each one with a care I had not exercised before, checking names, dates, details that once seemed fixed but now demanded confirmation, and with every page I read, I became more certain of one thing, that whatever Emily and Daniel believed about my awareness, they had underestimated my willingness to look closely, to ask questions, to understand every part of what belonged to me. The hours passed quietly, marked only by the soft ticking of the clock and the occasional sound of a car outside, and I used that time not to dwell on what I had lost, but to prepare for what might come next, organizing information, making notes, creating a clear picture of my situation as it truly was, not as it had been presented to me. At one point, I paused and looked out the window, watching the sunlight shift across the yard, the same yard where Daniel had played as a child, where I had once believed everything we built would remain untouched by the kind of calculation I had now seen, and I felt a brief ache at that memory, not sharp or overwhelming, but present, a reminder of what had been real and what had changed. I allowed that feeling to settle for a moment before letting it pass, because I understood now that holding on to it would not help me move forward, and forward was where I needed to focus. I returned to the table and closed the folder in front of me, aligning it neatly with the others, and as I did, I thought about the conversation I had overheard through that glowing screen, the certainty in their words, the quiet confidence that I would never question what they had planned, and I realized that their greatest advantage had been my silence, my trust, my willingness to believe that family would always act with care, but that advantage no longer existed. I stood up and walked through the house once more, not as someone uncertain of her place, but as someone reclaiming it step by step, my gaze steady, my thoughts clear, and when I returned to the kitchen, I allowed myself a small, controlled smile, not out of satisfaction, but out of understanding, because whatever came next, whatever they thought they were building behind my back, they were no longer the only ones making plans. The rest of the week moved forward with a strange kind of calm, the kind that settles in when something has already shifted beneath the surface and there is no going back to what things were before, and I found myself paying closer attention to everything, not just what was said, but what was not said, the pauses in conversations, the way Daniel's voice sounded over the phone when he called to check in, the careful tone Emily used when she asked if I needed anything, each detail now carrying weight it never had before. When Daniel called that evening, his voice warm but distant, I listened more than I spoke, letting him fill the silence the way he used to when he was younger. Only now there was something measured in his words, as if he was choosing them more carefully than usual, and I wondered how long that had been happening without me noticing. He asked about my day, about the house, about whether everything was running smoothly, and I answered simply, telling him everything was fine, that I had been organizing a few things, nothing out of the ordinary. And there was a brief pause on the other end of the line before he responded, a hesitation so slight it might have gone unnoticed before, but now it stood out clearly, like a note played just off key. I could almost picture him standing somewhere, perhaps in his office or his living room, holding the phone with that same expression I had seen in him recently, thoughtful but guarded, and I realized that whatever he knew, whatever he was part of, he was not entirely at ease with it, not completely settled in the role he was playing. We spoke for a few more minutes, the conversation drifting through familiar topics, work, the weather, plans for the weekend, and when he mentioned that they might come by in a few days, I felt that same quiet awareness settle in again, knowing that whatever they were preparing, it was getting closer to the moment when it would be presented to me as something reasonable, something inevitable. I agreed easily, telling him it would be nice to see them, and when we ended the call, I sat there for a moment with the phone still in my hand, considering the difference between what was being said and what was actually happening beneath it. Later that night, as I moved through the house turning off lights and locking doors, I found myself thinking back to the early years, to the time when Daniel would come home from school and tell me everything without hesitation, when there were no hidden meanings in his words, no careful calculations behind simple conversations, and I wondered when that had changed, not in a way that demanded an answer, but in a way that acknowledged the distance that now existed. I paused at the doorway to the living room, looking at the familiar arrangement of furniture, the same space where so many decisions had once been made together, openly and honestly, and I understood now that what I was facing was not just a plan about the house or my future, it was a shift in trust, in the way I was seen within my own family. I turned off the final light and stood there in the dim glow from the hallway, feeling that same steady resolve take hold again. Because whatever conversation they were preparing, whatever version of events they intended to present, I would be ready to hear it, not as someone caught off guard, but as someone who already understood more than they realized. The next morning arrived quietly, just as the others had, but this time there was something different in the way I approached it, a sense of readiness that had not been there before, and as I made my coffee and sat at the table, I found myself thinking not about what they might say, but about how I would respond, how I would choose my words, how I would let them believe, just for a little while longer, that everything was exactly as they expected it to be, because sometimes the most powerful position is not the one that reacts, but the one that waits, watches, and decides the moment when the truth is no longer hidden, but revealed on its own terms. The days leading up to their visit passed with a quiet precision that even I had not expected from myself. Each action measured, each thought carefully placed, and by the time the weekend arrived, I no longer felt like someone waiting for something to happen. I felt like someone who had already stepped ahead of it. That morning, I woke before the sun had fully risen, the house still wrapped in that soft early light that made everything appear gentler than it truly was, and I moved through my routine with the same calm efficiency I had built over a lifetime, making coffee, setting the table, arranging small details that would go unnoticed by anyone else, but grounded me in a sense of control. I chose my clothes deliberately, something simple and neat, the kind of outfit that carried no message other than quiet stability, because I understood now that appearances would matter, not for them, but for me, as a reminder of who I was in this moment. By mid-morning, I had already reviewed everything once more, the documents neatly placed back where they belonged, the notes in my notebook clear and complete, and the appointment I had scheduled still firmly set for the following week, a step that would move things forward in a way they could not anticipate. When I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway, I did not rush to the door. I simply stood where I was for a moment, letting the sound settle, recognizing it for what it was, not just their arrival, but the beginning of something they believed would unfold according to their plan. I opened the door just as they approached, greeting them with the same warmth I had always shown, the same gentle smile, the same familiar tone, and for a brief second I saw relief pass between them, subtle but unmistakable, as if they had been holding their breath without realizing it. Daniel hugged me first, his arms lingering just a moment longer than usual, and I could feel a hesitation in that embrace, something unspoken, something that told me he was not entirely comfortable with what was about to happen. While Emily followed with her usual composed demeanor, her smile precise, her eyes observant, taking in the room, the atmosphere, perhaps even searching for any sign that something had shifted. We moved into the living room together, settling into the same seats we had used for years, the arrangement unchanged, the setting familiar, and yet beneath it all there was a tension that had never been there before, something quiet but steady, like a current running just below the surface. The conversation began easily enough, small talk about the week, about work, about things that did not matter, and I let it continue, allowing them to ease into the moment, to feel comfortable enough to say what they had come to say, because I understood that people reveal more when they believe they are in control of the situation. Eventually, as I knew it would, the conversation shifted, not abruptly, but gradually. Daniel mentioning how busy life had become, how responsibilities change over time, how sometimes it makes sense to consider new arrangements that better suit everyone involved. And I listened without interruption, my expression attentive, my posture relaxed, giving nothing away, while Emily added her own thoughts, carefully worded, emphasizing comfort, convenience, the idea of making things easier for me. Her tone soft but purposeful, each sentence building toward something they had clearly rehearsed. I nodded occasionally, acknowledging their points, allowing them to continue, because the more they spoke, the clearer their intentions became, not just in what they said, but in how they said it, the confidence in their voices, the assumption that I would accept their reasoning without question. And as I sat there, listening to them lay out a future they had already begun to shape without me, I felt none of the confusion or hurt that might have come before. Only a steady awareness, a quiet understanding that this moment, the one they believed was the beginning of their plan, was in fact something very different, something they had not yet realized. Because while they spoke, thinking they were guiding the conversation, I was already several steps ahead, waiting for the exact moment when their certainty would meet something they had never prepared for. I let them finish without interruption, allowing their words to settle into the room as if they carried weight, as if they were something new, something I needed to consider for the first time. And when the silence finally came, it stretched just long enough for them to believe I was thinking it over, just long enough for Emily to shift slightly in her seat and for Daniel to glance at her before looking back at me. I folded my hands calmly in my lap and gave a small, thoughtful nod, the kind I had given countless times before when I wanted them to feel heard, when I wanted to keep the peace, and I told them I understood what they were saying, that life does change, that it is important to think ahead, to make decisions that make sense for everyone involved, and I saw the tension in their shoulders ease, just slightly, as if they had expected resistance but found none. Emily leaned forward then, her voice soft but more confident now, explaining how there were wonderful communities, designed for people my age, places with activities, support, convenience, all the words carefully chosen to sound like opportunity instead of removal, and Daniel added that it would give them more space as well, that it was practical, that it was the right time, and I listened to every word, my expression steady, my posture unchanged, because what mattered was not what they were saying, but how certain they were that I would accept it. When they finished, I took a slow breath and looked at them both, not with anger, not with hurt, but with a calm clarity that felt almost unfamiliar even to me, and I told them that I appreciated their concern, that it meant a great deal to know they were thinking about my future. And I watched as Emily's smile widened just slightly, as if she believed the conversation was already over, as if the outcome had been secured. Then I added, in the same even tone, that I had been thinking about my future as well, that I had spent the past few days reviewing some things, organizing documents, making sure everything was in order, and I noticed the shift immediately, subtle but undeniable, the way Daniel's expression tightened just for a moment. The way Emily's eyes sharpened as if she were recalculating something she had assumed was already settled. I continued without pause, explaining that after living in this house for so many years, I felt it was important to understand every detail of what I had, every decision that had been made, and every option that remained, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to be certain that whatever came next would be on my terms. The room grew quieter then, not empty, but filled with a different kind of attention, one that no longer belonged solely to them, and I leaned back slightly in my chair, maintaining that same composed demeanor, the same gentle tone, and I told them that I had already scheduled a meeting to review everything properly, to ensure that all my choices were clear and protected, and that once I had done that, I would be in a better position to decide what was truly best for me. I saw the confidence in their expressions shift into something less certain, something more cautious, and for the first time since they had arrived, they were no longer guiding the conversation. They were listening, trying to understand where they now stood. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse them of anything. I did not reveal what I knew, because I understood that power does not always come from confrontation. Sometimes it comes from allowing the truth to exist quietly, letting it change the balance without ever being spoken aloud. I offered them a small, polite smile and told them that there was no need to rush anything, that these decisions take time, that I would let them know when I had everything settled. And as I spoke, I could see it clearly now, the realization beginning to form behind their eyes, that whatever they had planned was no longer as simple as they believed. When they left later that afternoon, their steps were slower, their conversation quieter, and as I closed the door behind them, I stood there for a moment in the stillness of the house, not with a sense of victory, but with a quiet certainty, because they had walked in expecting one outcome, and they had left with something entirely different. And as I turned back toward the living room, I understood that this was only the beginning, not of their plan, but of mine.